First, Paul, I want to say thank you for being here, for being part of Central Washington University's Writing and Editing for Publication class in our creative writing program here. Um, would like to read a short bio for the students in the class. Paul E. Nelson, poet, editor, and interviewer, is the son of labor activist father and a Cuban immigrant mother. Born on Chicago's West Side in 1961, he's lived in King County since 1988. Paul founded the Cascadia Poets Lab, the Cascadia Poetry Festival, and co-founded the Poetry Postcard Festival, among other things. He is the author of 9 books of poetry, interviews, and collaborations. Most recently, Paul has co-edited Winter in America. Again, poets respond to the 2024 election. So thank you for being here, Paul.
It's a delight to be here, Javier. I'm grateful that you asked me.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to open up with one of the things that the students are asked to do in the class is to talk about their own editorial philosophy, what informs that. Could you share with us a little bit about your editorial philosophy and what from your past or or today has informed the foundation of that?
Well, when I interviewed Allen Ginsberg in 1994, he spoke very eloquently about poetics, and it was very clear that he came out of a tradition that very heavily favored Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound's ABC of reading continues to be prophetic and accurate in many ways. There are many aspects of Ezra Pound's life I can't say that about, but his poetics were spot on. And if you just look at his do's and don'ts, I hate to put things in such binary ways, but I think that it still holds water. And he talked about things, abstractions have to be earned or go in fear of abstractions. And I think that's really, really valid. There was a whole line of Allen Ginsberg's mind writing slogans. If you Google that, Allen Ginsberg mind writing slogans, you can see Ezra Pound and many other people who informed Allen's work. So I interviewed him in 1994, big influence. And the Pound tradition really stuck with me. It really resonated with me. Then the next year I interviewed Michael McClure, and he was talking about Charles Olson's essay, Projective Verse. And William Carlos Williams loved that essay so much, he put a big hunk of it in his own autobiography. It's about spontaneous poetics. It's about connecting to a state that's larger than ego. It was tremendously influential. A lot of people said that Olson fans were a cult, even. But I don't buy that. I just buy that he very much understood where verse was and where it needed to go to have relevance. And there's so much in it. It's so rich. It's at first when you take it on, it's like overwhelming. How do I make sense of this? And it took me a long time. Michael said, read it out loud and read it out loud several times because he was trying to write like Ezra Pound, kind of pedantic. But if you read it out loud, you'll get a sense that he was offering some tips. This worked for me, maybe it'll work for you. Not only did I read it out loud, but I recorded it at the radio station that I worked at. I was doing an overnight once a week at the jazz station, which was then called KPLU. And I just recorded it while the music was playing. I had to change the records. I'd go in, change the record, put the recording on pause, and I listened to it over and over and over again. And it makes sense then. It makes sense now. And I like to think the work that I've done has kind of pushed that to the next level. I think I've really understood, and Olson was talking about this, writing and really all art and all life as a continuum between open and closed. Open is one pole, closed is the other. And so I'm much more interested in the open. I think it's much more healthy to be open. And, it's a difficult thing to practice. It's a very Zen thing to be open. Something happens and you want to label it bad or good, but you could label it maybe and see what happens down the road. What looks like a closure and a rejection turns out to be opening you up for another possibility. So not rejection, but redirection. And I think that's really essential to understand in life, and a poetry practice can lead you there. So these are among the things that guide my aesthetic sensibilities.
Yeah, I really like that you talked about abstractions need to be earned. One of the core kind of principles that we go into revision in this course, at least within my own editorial philosophy, is that abstractions, I kind of do a mathematical formula called two truths and a lie. So image or concrete moments with action are positives, they're truths, and any tell when you're telling your reader something or you're speaking about an abstract emotion or an abstract moment, that those are lies. So as long as the writing is sort of formulated in the, two truths and a lie, and it keeps that sort of mathematical formula throughout, then it's above zero, which makes it sound in the craft writing. Yeah, if you could just talk a little bit more about what it means to you to earn an abstraction and also and then the second part of that, I was really curious about to be open part, and if you could just talk to the students a little bit more about specifically what that looks like.
Yeah, well, your formula is earning abstractions, right? If there are enough concrete images around any particular abstraction, then it's generally earned. Too much poetry, I'm not gonna name names. Uh, Too much poetry and too much of what goes over for good poetry in North America is very abstract. And I think the abstraction is reflecting a more superficial level of consciousness. Quite often they're placeholders. You can see an abstraction in there, or quite often an adjective, because they're filling up space because they can't describe the image adequately or don't have faith that the image will actually get across whatever emotion that they're trying to get across, whatever energy that's they're trying to get across. Louis Zukofsky said only emotion objectified endures. So how do we put those emotional resonances in actual tangible images? I mean, that's the key to poetry. I mean, everybody comes to poetry when they're new and they want to share all their deep feelings and they all use abstractions and it all sounds the same. All beginner poetry sounds the same because they're talking about abstractions. I remember one guy at a reading said, I don't like to read any other work. I don't like to have it affect my work. And what comes out of him is the boring abstract generalities that Allen Ginsberg said on my show, quote, paraphrasing William Blake, he said, abstractions and generalizations are the plea of the hypocrite, knave, and scoundrel. So you're calling them lies is a short version of what exactly William Blake was saying, Allen Ginsberg, Ezra Pound, and others who've been inspired by that, including Wanda Coleman, Joanne Kiger, Diana Prima, and Eileen Miles. I could go on and on and on. So that was the first part of the abstractions. And the second part of your question kind of went out of my mind.
Just what does being open look like?
Yeah, well, you sit down. um, I'm looking at the S section, Jack Spicer. He was giving lectures in Vancouver, BC, 1965, I think. And he said, and so remember 1965, what was going on in this country. He said, you sit down thinking you're going to write about the war in Vietnam, and yet your poem turns out to be about ice skating in Vermont. You know, it has a mind of its own. So how do you track that? How do you begin to track that voice you hear in your head in such a way that your listening is very, very refined? Olson, said syllable by syllable to
Mm.
see this. And those of us who have what Pound called a melopoeia, which comes from the same word as melody, a musicality in the verse, whether that be rhythm or assonance. It's usually not end rhyme in 2026. I think
Yes.
we've gotten beyond end rhyme. I mean, use end rhyme as a very, very limited spice or whatever, but not to be ba-boom, ba-boom, the kind of clunky uh, iambic pentameter, which we've heaved now for 100 years. So being open to where the poem wants to go. And if it surprises you,
Mm.
that's a good thing. I mean, if you think of your dreams, No one has a boring dream. No one has a dream. Oh man, I had this dream. Everybody says, I had this weird dream last night. Well, they're all weird. They're designed to be weird. They're supposed to be. You don't have a dream like I went to the corner grocery store and got a gallon of milk and came home and made a hot chocolate. That's usually not a dream. You make a hot chocolate and it turns out to be snake venom or something, something strange like that. So your poetry should have the same kind of surprise mind as your dreams do. And if you get in the habit of writing down your dreams, that's great fodder for poetry. If you get in the habit of carrying around a pocket journal, you know, that's a great little book to help you when you sit down to write a poem. You might even write it in the actual book, which activates a different part of your mind than typing on a keyboard will, and certainly activates a part of a mind that doesn't need AI.
Nice. I love that. I love that you're including different forms of writing practices. And I've always said or thought myself that the joy of writing for me is the process. It's the act of doing it. And then everything else in terms of, this class focuses on getting work ready for publication is the part of revision. Which, again, I love. And then it's the game. Publication is the game. I always say, if you get published, it doesn't mean your poem or prose story is any good. If you get rejected, it doesn't mean it's bad. A couple of things that are really awesome hearing you talk right now is, you're hitting on a lot of cornerstones that we preach in the class. We really do look at adjectives and adverbs and whether they're decreasing or basically decreasing the energy of the line and the image. Um, and then the dream part that you were talking about, that dreamlike state of writing poems, one of the core elements that I preach here about creating energy is leaping in the poem. So moving from one scene to a different scene, and also kind of making those cuts almost like cinema makes. So if you could just talk a little bit about how you feel to successfully use adjectives or adverbs, and then how do you create leaping in your own compositions?
These are great questions. First of all, to follow up the revision part, Brenda Hillman says, revise toward the strange. That's her advice. And I think she's one of the
Nice.
most brilliant poets alive. The second thing is with adverbs and adjectives, I'm sorry, adverbs and gerunds
Yeah.
often, ing words, ly words. Ly goes in there, adverbs go in there because of a syntax that is a normative syntax, the syntax of proper public speaking. And poetry is not that. It can be that. It
Mhm.
doesn't have to be not that. But to put adverbs in because you're being grammatically correct, you're adding another syllable that's adding zero meaning to the content underhand. So they're they're deadly to use an
Mhm.
to use an adverb. They can be deadly. It doesn't mean never use an adverb, but I would get out of the practice of using them because, you know, if I said to you, instead of saying they're deadly, if I just said they're dead, you'd get the idea of what I'm talking about. So that's one of the things about adverbs. And then I'd like to bring up, um, I have this, my personal website is paulinelson.com, and I have this poetics page. So I'm going to share, because there's so much projective verse by Charles Olson, a link to Allen Ginsberg's mind writing slogans. All that is here. And something specific about adjectives is up here, and I believe it's in the H's. Um, so here it is. El adjetivo cuando no da vida mata. When the adjective does not give life, it kills. And
Mm.
and I love that is Vicente Huidobro, right? So we're taking out of U.S. American Anglo culture and we're taking it into South American culture, and it's universal. So here's a world poet. Jose Kozer is the one who tipped me off to this, and it's just so brilliant that I just put it on this poetics. So whenever I want to see it, I just go to paulinelson.com/poetics and I scroll down there, and there it is. So, and there's other great quotes here. I'll just read one since it's in front of me. Ronald Johnson, who wrote the great serial poem Ark, in a talk in Madison, Wisconsin, 1985. He said, if you write poetry at all, do you think, God, I'm never going to write again? I've never got it right. But if you've got a project, and my theory is that you ask the universe a question, it's going to answer you one way or another, no matter how you look at it, no matter where you go. It could be just looking at the sidewalk, it could be looking at the town or something, whatever Victorian poets did. But I mean, if you goddamn well ask it a question, it's going to give you the answer. So
Nice.
these are little bits. So when you go over the poem, you see where the energy drops out. And you know, your best time to go over the poem is right after you've written it and read it out loud. And the
Mm,
first thing to check is, am I reading the line breaks properly? You know,
mm,
so you're reading a line da 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 da. But if you're reading it through, then change the line breaks. Make the line breaks appear as you want them to be read. Have some kind of system for that. I think that's really crucial. I also think when you see the materialization of your thought on the page, and you begin to hone that connection between that inner mind, that silent mind, that voice that we hear in our heads, and how it looks on the page, you develop an affinity for that. It strengthens your writing process and your intuition when you can properly lineate it instead of just doing what most people do these days and making couplets,
mhm,
which I hate. And you hear them read their couplets and they read right through them. So what's the point of line breaks?
mhm.
So I think that each poem has its own syntax, and it's up to you to learn what that is and to follow it and to make it fresh.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. We do spend a lot of time on the importance of line breaks and a specific. So this is a poetry and prose um uh uh sort of class that we look at both things. Definitely in poetry we focus on the line breaks. A lot of what I like to share is the process of enjambment or the practice of enjamming a line, creating tension on the line to create energy. I loved what you said about reading it out loud. It's also another thing that we try to reinforce here. And so, getting back to the dreamlike nature of a poem, and I think those are the most successful poems. Um, so one of the things that I try to work through students with is that this thing where any good image or any good concrete moment with action, it doesn't even matter if it's part of the same piece, can be assembled because they're their own complete little unit, kind of like a little Lego block. And you can just stack them however you want, and it makes this new thing. I was just wondering a little bit about your process in terms of, do you create leaping as you write? Does that happen in your revision process? How do you go about that?
Well, there's not much revision because I trained myself how to get it right in the first take.
Hmm. Nice.
And so when I read it out loud, there will be slight revisions. Maybe I'll move a word over. Maybe I'll add a comma. Maybe there was a word that's inaccurate, so I'll change that. But I try not to spend a whole lot of time fixing a poem. Denise Levertov, in her Some Notes on Organic Form essay, said, if you have to do extensive renovation, extensive revision of a poem after you've written it, then it probably didn't incubate long enough.
Hmm.
So I practice spontaneous composition every day. In my journal, it's spontaneous. In my 17 syllable poem practice, now called Cascadian Sentences, it's spontaneous. I carry the journal with me, you know, and there was a dream I had, and I'm like, oh, I'm going to use that. That's potent. I'm going to use that. And so I included it in a poem that I wrote doing a day song, doing a whole day writing exercise. And I included that and I read it aloud on Monday night. And as I'm reading it, I'm like, this is going to get a few chuckles. And it's so true. And it's really a comment on what's going on. It came from a series of poems written after Theodore Roethke's The Far Field, which I called Cascadia as a field of action after a line that Matt Tree suggested. So that's that's how that section got started. Retke was talking about a dream, and so I'm like, well, I've got a dream, recent
Mhm.
dream, that I want
Yeah.
to talk about. They,
Yeah.
I think it's something like, they tell me the dead man is fine. He is in Canada. Was the
That's the great leap right
line.
there, right? That's the great leap, and it's so much of what goes into a poem. At least what I'm looking for in a poem. I'm glad you brought up Rudke because when you were talking about the dreamlike, like one of the core textbooks I use in modeling poetry is, of course, anything by Richard Hugo. And I love Richard Hugo. I can't remember the exact name of the book, but it's something like 13 Letters and 21 Dreams. And the poems are just so dreamlike and so rich with leaping that it's just a textbook model of how to leap in poetry. I really, really think that that's great. Um, so I'm going to move on to a student question. Thank you for that response to the initial question. So a student asked, "What do you look for in a poem or prose when selecting the work to go into an anthology?"
Authenticity is really the key of all writing, of all art. If it feels false, then it's not going to get in. And you can usually tell in a few lines whether the poet has any chops or not. I hate open call. I don't like to be involved with them because you have to plow through so much shit to get to what you want. I love the way that Nate Mackey did Hambone. It's like, it's time for a new edition of this journal. I'll ask 20 of my friends for poems. If they send me anything halfway good, I'll publish it. It's very, very simple. Of course, it pays
Mhm.
to have friends who can write and who are tapped in. But with younger poets, it's like, uh, we published several younger poets in Winter in America again and Winter in America still. And authenticity is key. When you're leaning on abstractions or adjectives, that's a step away from the source. That's a step away from what's truly going on inside of you. So that's key. And cliches. Wanda Coleman, she was very clear about cliches. If you're using a cliche, it's okay, just break it. Instead of red as a rose, it's red as the corner of your eye or something. I don't know, something original, you know?
Yes.
So you got to break the cliches. You got to see them, and that often happens. That could happen in the revision process, or if you write projectively long enough, you kind of hear it in your head before you write it down. I'm not going to write that. I'm going to write, or you're writing and you think this has been too abstract. I've got to have an image. What's going on? Oh, there's a kingfisher going
Mhm.
across. I mean, these things happen for a reason.
Yeah. It's interesting that we're speaking about Winter in America and uh, the 2024 election and Winter in America still. Leads on to earlier you were talking about, a project. What I was just recently visiting a writer at Notre Dame, at the University of Notre Dame, and talking with one of their directors of their creative writing program, asking him what do you look for in students that you're accepting into your graduate program? And he looks for ideas, right? So of course there's a certain level of craft. It's going to be excellent that are coming in. But then secondly, looking for students with ideas, projects, right? Different ways of looking at it. Can you just talk a little bit about the idea that went into Winter in America and how that came to be?
Well, the quality that professor is talking about, Pound described as logopoeia. What is the content of what's going on? Pound had three things: melopoeia, logopoeia, and phanopoeia. So melopoeia being the music of it, phanopoeia being the imagery, and logopoeia being the content going on. So that is, and that comes from Pound, and I think they did some work at Naropa years after that in the 70s or 80s that extended that Poundian tradition. And that essay, I think, is in the Ed Sanders' The Fully Developed Bard. Now, the second part of your question was,
How do you go about like landing on a project?
yeah,
So one of the things that in terms of my own graduate education, MFA for creative writing, was, we didn't feel like we needed to wait for any sort of like degree or anything. So a couple of us got together, we thought of a project, and we proposed it to a few regional publishers there and got it accepted. And so we went through the whole process as students, basically, about putting together an anthology and then seeing it complete and with publication and, selecting the work and revising editing the work as once it's accepted. And so I'm just wondering a little bit if you could just talk to the students about, you know, uh, what goes into that for you in terms of when it's the right thing to land on and to do.
Well, I got a call from Katie Sarah Zale the day after the election of Trump, the most recent election of Trump, and she said she was depressed as hell, and she said asked herself, what would Sam Hamill do, the guy who founded Copper Canyon Press and Poets Against the War, which was the largest single theme anthology in the history of time, with over 20,000 poems about the war in Iraq. And she said Sam would start an anthology. He would create an anthology in responding to this moment. And I said, yeah, we should. And we should call it Winter in America Again. And she's like,
Mhm.
why that? And I said, well, Gil Scott-Heron was an artist, a proto-rap musician. He has been called, although I think that doesn't give him enough credit for the literary skills that he had. In fact, I just interviewed Eldon Nielsen about Gil Scott-Heron and the merit of considering him from a literary context, which I think is very valid. And Gil, was talking in 1974 how it was winter in America again,
Mhm.
how the Klan, Klan type activity, literal Klan activity and Klan-like activity, as tracked by the Southern Poverty Law Center, was on the increase again. Once Obama got elected, freaked out white people are like, we can't have something like this happen because I'm better than that because I'm not black. So racism there was a recrudescence of racism in this country, and we've seen what's going on. Just the shooting in San Diego, the of the mosque, the the Muslim mosque there is just horrific, and this comes from very loose use of language, a non-sacred use of language, a very careless use of language. And so that's why poetry has to be very specific about that. So she said, she didn't know what Winter in America was. So I had her, went to YouTube and said, here it is,
Mhm.
go check
Yeah.
it out. And what I was trying to say with that gesture is that there's a lineage of resistance in this country. And it's more obvious in the day-to-day lives and the heritages of people of color and queer people because they've been on the margins. And so they've had to fight like this. Mexican people have been kicked out of the country for no good reason. Japanese American people have been put in concentration camps for no reason. So Gil said, "Winter in America," and here we are, Winter in America again. So I was lining myself up with that resistance that was embodied by Gil Scott Heron and trying to say to people, hey, we knew what Gil was saying, and we're with him then. We were with him then, and we're with him now, and he informs what we do. So that kind of gave the container for the whole thing. And then having a editor on the anthology editorial board, Aliyah Abdullah Mata, who's a Muslim, a black Muslim woman from New York. So
Mhm.
that's a whole nother geography that I'm not familiar with. So New York is covered. Tucson, Arizona, where Katie lives, is covered, although she has got a long tradition here in Cascadia. Myself and Roxy Power and other editors, Roxy Power in Santa Cruz. So we had a
Mhm.
pretty good geographic distribution, and things came from there. So that was a little bit about an anthology project. In
Mhm.
terms of a personal project, I moved to Auburn, Washington in 1992. Before I was a poet, Auburn was my triggering town, if you want to use Richard
Nice.
Hugo again.
Yeah.
And I felt that I could do this, that I had something in me. And then I got a chance to interview Ginsberg and McClure and other people like that. And it just came from there. And, as I'm interviewing these people, they're revealing to me the things that they think are important. So
Mm.
the book Patterson by William Carlos Williams. Now,
Yeah.
they were calling it an epic poem. Charles Olson, the Cantos by Ezra Pound, these were referred to as epic poems. And, that characterization never really sat right with me. But then I learned about the serial poem, and as practiced by Robert Duncan, Robin Blazer, Jack Spicer, and later people like Daphne Marlett and George Stanley, I guess, was there near the beginning of the quote unquote serial poem, which seems more open. Nate Mackey is a great practitioner of the serial poem. His Song of the Undumbulu and Mu, it's a two sort of themed serial poem, is just fascinating use of language. And so I was living in Auburn, Washington, learned that the town was originally called Slaughter,
Mm.
knew one of the rivers was called Stuck. So I thought, these are great words for poetry. And it
Yeah.
turns out the Stuck River is not from, it was stuck one time, but it comes from a Lashutzide word meaning plowed through.
Hmm.
And there's a myth that that was all part of the ocean, and that the whales were tired of being, well, it was actually connected or not connected to the ocean, but the whales wanted it to be connected because they were tired of being in this small area. So they plowed through, and in their wake was this river that became known as Stack, S-T-A-Q, which the settlers said stuck as a way of understanding. And then it was blown up several times. The King County farmers wanted land, so they blew up a log jam on the Muckleshoot Res, and the river went into Pierce County, and they had farmland. The Pierce County farmers were like, well, two can play at that, so they got on the res and blew up the log jam, and it went back and forth a couple of times till the Army Corps of Engineers said, we're stopping this now. This river is going to stay stuck, and they're going to build this diversion dam, which you can walk on at Auburn's Game Farm Park.
Oh.
One thing about this is Joanne Kiger says it's a political act to know the history of your place. And
Mm.
that resonated with me, although I didn't hear that years later. But it was Joanne, one of the people who said, sounds like you're writing a Patterson for Slaughter. And
Mm.
when an elder says that, you got to pay attention. And I was off and running. And then it was nominated for a Stranger Genius Award in 2010, and then lost to a guy in the literature category who doesn't use words. It was a
Yeah.
graphic novelist.
Yeah, I love that you said elder there. I think America has it so perversely backwards in terms of, especially in the literary world and game, when, we're celebrating young authors, where we want to know who the next young poet is. And that's great. I like this idea of an emerging poet, of course, but like on my last book, when the editor or the publisher was asking for, who would I like to blurb the book, I said, well, you know, uh, it's whoever they are, they have to be older than me, you know, and so there are young, Ocean Vuong being a young writing talent that I really admire. But for the most part, I like this idea that we get our knowledge from elders. We had an issue one time, and we approached someone from the Yakima Nation, and asked them, what do you think about this? And their response was classic. It was like, well, it really doesn't matter what I think. And this woman is a woman of power, and she was like, I need to go speak to my elders, who had no official capacity other than, that understanding that the elders is where we get are informed by. So, I do like to go back and read a lot of the authors that you're referencing, and see where that lineage came down. On the politics, I think that's so important, that knowing your place is a political act. One of the things that I would always kind of talk about too is even culturally, like knowing your food is a political act, right? knowing the songs from your cultures and political acts. So I really appreciate that. And, I'm so glad you brought up Gil Scott Heron because, of course, for me, being a young Mexican American in the Pacific Northwest, and then getting an ear early on as a, early teenager to the beats, the West Coast beats, and then balancing that with the Gil Scott Heron, the revolution will not be televised. It's just the work that they're producing is often what I would call in straight alignment with what we read a book, a textbook, Scott, about Max Perkins, Everett Max Perkins, who of course, edited Thomas Wolfe, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and the list goes on and on and on. But it's about finding that young talent, seeking that young talent that's doing something innovating, and doing something against the thing. So I like this idea of how radical the Beats were, or how radical Gil Scott Heron was, But I always push back on in terms of, letting someone younger than myself sort of speak on any sort of thing beyond that. And you know, so I work myself with editors that are more experienced than me, that are older than me. I read the work of that, and I think that's very important for students to kind of grasp and understand a little bit. So I'm going to move into another student question, and speaking about knowing place as a political act. As the son of a labor activist and Cuban immigrant mother, how does that filter into your own writing and editing?
Well, the labor movement is, as the labor movement goes, so goes this country, so goes the world. It created that middle class, and my dad was a beneficiary of, the largest middle class in the history of time. And what has happened since then? Neoliberalism, Ronald Reagan. Gil Scott Heron was there saying that we're just living through another B movie with Ronald Reagan being president. This ain't really life, ain't really life, ain't really nothing but a movie, right? And it was a horror movie, as it turns out, because look at the people camped. Look at the tents. You don't have that too much in Ellensburg, but you do have homeless folks in Ellensburg, and you take care of them like a town should. I saw that the last time I was in town. But you go to Seattle or Portland or Vancouver, and it looks like hellscapes because of neoliberalism, because we treat people basically on how much money they can come up with, how much they're worth, and that is antithetical to human concerns. So that's the first thing I would
Mhm.
say about it. I'm having trouble tracking your questions. Tell me the question again.
Just how the you being a son of
Yeah.
a
So that
labor
was
activist and
yeah,
Cuban
yeah,
mother,
so
Cuban immigrant mother.
that was a labor part of it. My dad, and the other thing about my dad, I had a poem called Nine Sonnets for Pop, and I wrote him after he had some strokes. So it was kind of an elegy, and so I was ready when he died. I already had the elegy written, which was very interesting. And you wake up early, you pay your dues, you pay your union dues, your literal dues and your figurative dues. You
Mhm.
show up every day for work, you show up on time, you have a work ethic, and that, a lot of that came from my dad, working for the railroad and being involved in the union, and letting black people know they had a place, that they were union brothers. My dad would tell me the story of being involved, and that's part of why I put that in my in my biography.
Mhm.
The second part, my mom was still alive, who I just visited earlier this month in Chicago. She was born in Cuba. I was born in Chicago in 1961. You know,
Mhm.
I was a spick, and
Mhm.
I would be a spick in Chicago in 1961, 71, whenever. I never
Mhm.
quite fit in because I didn't really resonate with a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant kind of ethos or cosmology. My best friend was a Greek guy who turned out to be a White Sox fan. We found affinities because we were both White Sox fans living on the north side of Chicago. The Greeks, could, and he was, as it turns out, very virulently racist because the
Mm,
Greeks weren't considered white people. So they're like, well, we may not be white people, but we're not that, you know? So
mhm,
it's very interesting. I had two Greek friends. One of them just moved to the US from Greek in fourth grade when I met this other guy. And he wasn't like that at all. He read Isaac Asimov and he didn't act like that. So it's very interesting to see that. But I've never really fit in to the white power structure. I don't mean white power structures. I mean white power structures. I think because of that, because of my heritage, you know,
mhm,
and I quote unquote I present as a white man, you know,
mhm,
but I don't feel like it. I don't act like it, and I've never had that ethos. You know, Gary Snyder talks about what white is, and it's a culture. It's not a skin tone, right? More so, it's a culture than a skin tone, and so trying to fit in has been hard. I've had to carve my own. That's why I run my own organization. I've had difficulty at different places. When I went to Cuba, I saw my cousin's boyfriend yelling at this guy, and I'm like, "Oh shit! I better get my shoes on. He's going to need me to have his back." You know. And by the time I had my shoes on, I looked, and they were smiling and slapping each other on the back. But the intensity of that moment made me realize fuck, that's why I'm intense. Because it's that Cuban heritage. And my father's side, there's Irish blood too. So you
mhm,
you got blood, hot blood on both sides. And let me tell you, having that hot blood, not fitting in, having a real strong sense of justice. I remember telling my dad when I was 4 or 5 years old, that's not fair. It's not fair. He'd say, well, life isn't fair, you know?
mhm. Yeah.
And, you have to be open uh, to life's unfairnesses. What's going on now, what we're going through with Trump is not fair at all. Having a
Mhm.
$1.7 billion slush fund is not fair, it's not legal, and it needs to stop. So how do we begin to do that? How can we come together? We have to transcend our differences. We have to find the common goal. We have to find the ideas and laws and the Constitution that we agree on and move forward from there. Have that as a baseline.
Yeah, it's really the first time. I mean, I've always been politically engaged, and politics and culture has always informed my writing in one way. Also, spirituality and religion as well. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your spirituality and how it informs your writing.
Well, I grew up in the Baptist church till my dad left the house and they wanted to make me a deacon and I got kind of freaked out. And then and my mom, her mother was an espiritista. She was a spirit medium in Cuba. So she told fortunes and channeled an African entity, actually.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the poetry comes from, to be honest. And her mother, my great grandmother, was also a poet. She had a book called La Cautiva, The Captive, and you can imagine in communist Cuba the resonances of that. But she also had arthritis of the spine and was bedridden, I think, for the last 30 years of her life. So she was
Mhm.
captive in that way as well. So that's at the core of it. And then before I moved to Seattle, I started sniffing around metaphysical things. I met a psychic in um, when I was working in Peoria, Illinois, and she did a tarot reading and saw me working at a radio station with lights and looking over the water. And I thought for sure I was going to Chicago. And she saw my view from Seattle, where I ended up after Peoria, moved from Peoria to Seattle. And it was like, holy shit, she was tapped in on some level.
Yeah.
So I started getting into metaphysical things, New Age, started going to psychic fairs and things like that. Eventually ended up uh, becoming a member of the Subud spiritual community, not a religion, but more a practice. I came out of Indonesia. It's also very spontaneous. Some of the beats were opened in Subud, but didn't
Sure.
really stick, like Ginsberg and McClure. They at least
Mhm.
tried it. McClure wrote about the spiritual practice Latihan Kejuan in his essay called Reason, which was in the second edition of Meat Science Essays. And it's a great description of Latian, which you're not supposed to do. You're supposed to ignore other people and just be tapped into your own receiving. And I was in Subud. I'm still technically in Sioux, but I still technically do Latihan, especially here at the house. But then I found Zen, a Zen community here. So Soto Zen, I resonate very deeply with Soto Zen. The fact that it was founded by a poet, Dogen, who lived from 1200 to 1253 in the Common Era, is just icing on the cake. McClure was heavily influenced by Dogen. Gary Snyder, Mountains and Rivers Without End, is a direct um, reference to a Dogen fascicle from his Shobogenzo. And, Dogen was not like sitting to become a better person or sitting to reduce your stress level. And when I say sitting, I mean meditation. He was like, enlightened people meditate. That's what they do. So just sit. And the Japanese word he used was shikantaza, just sit.
Mhm.
And finding Zen has been the most logical extension of that move towards the open.
Mhm.
And Kosho's a great teacher. We go into his house in the basement. I call it the Dharma basement. I did in a poem. He gets a big kick out. He gets a kick out of me. He's also a brilliant writer with a great Substack um, uh, account, Kinpu, Kinpu, Kosho. And he's a very traditional person, but that tradition, as applied to living here at this time, I think is extremely radical. And I'm grateful to know him and grateful to have that. I think that writing, journaling is part of the spiritual path. Doing yoga is part of the spiritual path. Having a mind-body connection and being aware of that. Knowing that when things happen to me with illness or problems with certain body parts, that's reflecting a thought pattern that's not aligned with um, the divine or a noble kind of thinking. So I think we get sick to remind ourselves that we need to stop thinking in a certain way. For me, getting chronic lymphocytic leukemia was about a lack of joy and a lack of circulation of ideas. And so when I got that diagnosis and I read that's what Louise Hay says about that particular condition, I thought I'm going to turn this around by giving thanks every morning. I wake up, I give thanks, and it's almost like a free associative poem. I give
Yeah.
thanks that I had a chance to talk to Javier. I give thanks that I live on Lake Washington with a beautiful view. I give thanks that I have nice clothes. I've got lots of books. I've got a beautiful wife who loves me. And you can go on and on and on. And I think we don't enough give thanks. I'm thankful that I have good eyesight, that I can see you. I'm thankful I have a good internet connection so you can hear me. I'm thankful my computer's good enough to only frizz out every now and then during this talk. I'm thankful for this microphone that my sister-in-law gave me that makes it sound very good. I'm thankful I'm getting over this cold. I can still maybe hear a little bit of it. I'm thankful I was in Japan and I was turned on to hoji cha tea and saw the roasting of it. It looked like, those sausage machines where it kind of comes out, and then drops off. That's what the tea was doing, and the cloud of hoji cha was coming. It's the one thing I regret not taking a picture of or a video of because it was amazing. So when you get into the gratitude mode, you can you can see it go on and on and on. And I think that should be at the core of any spirituality. In fact, if you have that, you probably don't need a religion or a spirituality. But I think religions are good things. They help you become noble. When they
Mhm.
stop helping you become noble and start attacking people, that's when you know that something has been twisted in the wrong way.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. I've explored different religions that have informed my writing all throughout my life. Early on with Catholicism, and then into Christianity, and then of course spending a lot of time in Cuba myself and looking at their different African Yoruba uh, uh, religious practices, and then I'm back into Christianity, and but that's the core of it, like gratitude, right? As soon as you know I was talking with a friend earlier this week about grace and what grace is, and gratitude, and to be every day in motion with delight and sweetness, and it's so, it's I'm also a member of a 12-step program, and we have a lot of gratitude in that. And I'll see people in the program sometimes that are oh, there's always chaos still, like no matter what situation is happening in life, like I experience it in a very graceful, peaceful, and grateful way. I'm so grateful, likewise. And when you were giving your list of what you were grateful for, it really reminded me a lot of a lot of the time I spent personally with Ginsberg, how, that was also a thing about, having gratitude and grace. And I think it's a perfect thing to end the interview on. And one of the things that I ask the students to do is to have an editorial philosophy, and then to also have an artistic philosophy, and from what background informs your editing philosophy approaches. And I think you spoke brilliantly on all of those things. Is there any last thing that you would like to say to students that are beginning into their journey as professional writers and practitioners of practice of writing and editing themselves, and anything in general?
Yeah. First of all, since we're talking about Catholics, know that the Pope is a Sox fan. I
Yeah.
don't think I need to say. Somebody said, "Hey, how about the Cubs?" And he said, "Han perdido," to the guy. They lost. That's important. Barry McKinnon was saying that he found he had read, and I never found the citation, that William Carlos Williams said that every poem you write should be a summation of your life up until that point. And so, what is your personal mythology is a good question to
Mm,
ask yourself and to learn about that, learn on a real deep level who you are. If you look into that and find you don't like it, change your personal mythology. And then Sam Hamill, and um, he was a big um, influence on me. I'm his literary executor. So a lot of my lessons came from Sam. He said, don't be in a hurry to publish. I often, when I write a poem, I'll put it into my journal, and then I usually read my journal a year later. And, you're like, it either has the juice or it doesn't. When you read it a year later, you're looking at it with different eyes. So
yeah.
it helps to sit on things for a while, or to have a group you can trust that tells you it's pretty good. And then the last thing I'll share comes directly from Sam, and I keep this on a blog post. And let me just see if I can share screen, if that's okay. And then this is good. So Sam at 70 on my paulynelson.com. One time I was struggling with people who call themselves poets but seem to create events for themselves rather than the community, like curating a reading series and making themselves featured readers at it. I always thought there ought to be a line if you're curating, but not everyone agreed. And if I ever bring it up, I'd end up losing a friend or going through some kind of conflict. Sam made it clear what was happening in these cases. It's not the process, it's the life of poetry. All this clamoring to be public is not only a nuisance, but a squandering of money and goodwill. These are not budding Buddhas. They are oni, little poetry demons that trivialize the life of poetry, which is a path, not a destination.
Mm.
In the great not knowing, there is only the learning, the path, the way. The little oni keep dancing and trying to become big devils, undermining principles and true practices.
Nice. Yeah, I think that's great. And of course, Sam Hamill, the founder, right? The founder of Copper Canyon Press.
Co-founder, yeah.
Um, yeah, and something that a lot of our students in the program really admire that press, and the historical lineage, and the just the brilliance of the authors, and what the press stands for. You did say something though that I want to ask one more thing, because this was a student question, and you sort of tipped on it, and so I just, if you're okay with that, okay. So, as an editor, uh, how do you go about making editorial suggestions to writers or amongst peers in your own writing community?
Very carefully.
Yeah.
You know, you have to ask them if they're open to it. And I worked with some people on the last anthology saying, do you mind if I just take a crack at this? And I would take out the abstractions and the conjunction, many of the conjunctions, and tighten it up, and really carve off some of the fat in the poem. And I was able to do it in like 6 minutes. Take a moment, 6 minutes later, here it is.
Yeah.
Because many critique groups, you hear what the problems are, you hear what the issues are, and some people are open to that, and some people don't want that at all. So the first thing is, would you mind if I offered a suggestion? You know, I think red as a rose has been used before, so
Yeah.
maybe you want to try something else. But how you come to it, if you come to it with, I know better than you, and I'm going to show you more on how to write a decent poem, that's never going to go over well. But if you come from a point of, being a human being and, hey, I know you're a good writer, and I want to make sure that you're reflected in the best possible way, and I have some ideas which you may find useful. May I offer them? you know. And I think when you can come from a win-win situation, then and you have to have that intent in your heart when you do that. So much criticism is people, I'll show this motherfucker. It's not,
Yeah.
I'm trying to do a service to the community, and you could see that. And these things don't hold up over time. Robert Christgau writing about Return Forever and just being very mean. I think that was the guy. What's the point of that? To show how cool you are, to show how knowledgeable you are. That and $8 will get me an oat matcha at Starbucks.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah. Yeah. No, I really love that. One of the things that I learned from Ginsberg as a younger student of him, in my 20s was he would say to me that in terms of feedback, he was like, you gotta do it in three stages. You give the person praise so that you don't hurt their feelings. You give them praise about something that's really working in their poem. And then you hit the critical craft level suggestions. And then you end again with praise and a compliment. And I was fortunate enough to be around him enough. And also, I was never a student at Brooklyn College, but he would let me come in and sit in on his classes of Blake. And so, I got to see that really in action with graduate students there and how he would comment. And so it was just really a wonderful sort of learning about that approach. I love that it's about openness, and one of the things I try to preach here is to be open to the suggestions and that whatever is clear to them as the creator is not clear to a reader, and that's the thing. So I also love about putting it aside, letting it stew for a year and coming at it because it is completely different than I love about reading it aloud that you were talking about and the orality. And, just yesterday I was working with a student and I was like, well, how does that sound? And they were like, well, it kind of sounds weird. And I said, well, it's because it is weird, like and that means like, let's look at this, let's look at this sentence. And so yeah, man, what a pleasure it's been, Paul, to spend an hour with you and gain more knowledge. And I just love that a lot of the things you said speak directly to the philosophies of a writing practice and what informs it and the editorial statements that the students are going to need to sort of start thinking about on their own. So it's been a wonderful time, and I just want to thank you very much.
I'm grateful for your stewardship of this experience. I'm grateful that you asked me, and I look forward to working with you in the future.
Cool, cool. Yeah, yeah, for sure. All right, Paul.